Serious, Redditors who work at cemeteries and graveyards, what strange and scary stuff have you witnessed? I work at a graveyard, and I just have one thing to say. Plastic. Here in Norway, graves are protected by law for 20 years, but after that the spots can be reused. Usually a grave is fine to reopen after 20 years, the body is supposed to be decomposed and pretty much gone. Now back to plastic. Between the 50s and 80s it was common here to be buried in plastic, to minimize smell and leakage. I'm sure they thought it was a good idea back then, but once we started reusing graves in Norway we realized it is a curse. A lot of bodies are wrapped in plastic, and I've myself been part of what was supposed to be a burial at a reused site. The body was about 50 or 60 years old, and should be basically gone, but nope, it was not. The plastic wrap it was covered by kept the body from decomposing, and it's basically just been marinated in its own juices for 50-60 years. The smell was awful, the sight was even worse. I'm sure this is not the kind of story you wanted, but it's honestly the most horrific and bizarre thing I've ever been part of. Not really a cemetery experience, but it was still pretty freaky. My grandparents live out in the middle of nowhere pretty much and is surrounded by woods. On their property, there was a whole family that owned my grandparents' property before them. From what I was told they were killed or something like that. A few years ago, when I was still living with my grandparents, a relative that was related to the dead family came up to the property and wanted to remove the bodies from the land. My grandpa was extremely happy about it because he wanted to expand the house but couldn't because he didn't want to mess with the graves. So they got together and I stood nearby, watching them dig up 4 caskets. There were 3 adult-sized caskets and 1 child-sized casket. And they all looked really old. One of the bigger caskets had holes and cracks all over it. That was the one that my grandpa and the other relative was carrying when the body fell out the bottom of the casket. The body was pretty much bones but it still had old muscle and tissue on it. I remember feeling sick to my stomach as I watched them uncomfortably put the body back into the casket upside down. Former funeral director here. My partner and I had just gotten back to the funeral home from a house call for a 31-year-old woman who died of cancer. As we were moving her body from the cot to embalming table we heard an audible click and the radio across the room turned on full volume of static. It's one of those old radios you turn the volume dial until it clicks to turn it on. We both looked at each other. He was an extremely religious man and this event visibly shook him and he left not long after the incident. I shut the radio off as I typically used my phone to listen to music while embalming. When I'd finished the procedure and was attempting to move her from the embalming table to a dressing table I heard that click from that old radio and it turned on full volume yet again. At that point I was fairly freaked out and made my exit not long after. My partner and I never spoke of it again and nothing like that ever occurred to my knowledge before or after. I used to do some odd jobs at the 12th century graveyard in my hometown. 12th century, as in the church and its surrounding graveyard had been in continuous use for at least that long. When you keep burying bodies in the same small patch of ground for that many centuries, eventually the soil has been turned over dozens of times and consists mainly of bone fragments. You can't even plant flowers there without accidentally uncovering some teeth or finger bones or something. It's nothing but fragmented skeletons all the way down under the thin turf. The soil sort of resembles seaside shell sand, except on closer examination all the light-colored bits are bone fragments rather than crushed seashells. Not really scary or unexpected, just a bit eerie until you get used to it. You learn to treat anything recognizable as human remains with respect, and just tuck it away out of sight under the plant or whatever else you were putting there. Former funeral director here. One of our workers cleaned up after everyone had left from a visitation/viewing/wake. It was about 9 p.m. or later and he saw one last guest walking around in the visitation room. He went to help escort the gentleman out when he discovered no one was in there. When he came back in and told us the story and described the visitor. He identified the man in a photo we had at the funeral home. It was my grandfather, family business, who had recently passed. My dad purchased a cemetery when I was in middle school, and I worked for him through high school graduation. I did yard work, mowing, weed eating, flower beds, etc. Aside from the occasional shadows seen out of the corner of my eye, seeing people who turned out to not be there, and hearing strange sounds, the cemetery was actually a quite peaceful place. But the strangest is when you have a burial in the crypts. Basically, you dig down about 4 or 5 feet to expose giant cement doors. You pull the cement doors off and drop down into a little room. These rooms can fit 2 coffins, or years and years and years worth of cremated remains. So back in the 50s and 60s, families would buy one crypt and the entire fam would be cremated and put in it. Some just put the cremated remains in it and close her up, but others light candles and leave flowers and souvenirs and pictures and shit. It's fucking creepy opening up one of those bad boys after 50 years and finding melted candles and old pictures of the people inside. Plus when you hop down in there you have a weird realization that you are at the same level and completely surrounded by bodies. Strange people visiting. I worked at the cemetery Jimi Hendrix is buried at, so lots of weed and people hanging around. We found a dead homeless man behind a mausoleum, smelled him first. One time, getting ready to bury a person, we dug a grave. It was in a section of the graveyard that had very old burials, 100 plus years, so wooden caskets. My foreman at the time was squaring off the hole with a shovel, then he saw a skull looking right at him. He quickly and quietly pushed it farther into the dirt and told us not to say anything. If the office people had found out, it would have been a whole thing. Digging it up, trying to figure out who it was, etc. Never saw a ghost, but some of the old timers say they did. Not sure if I believe them. Lots of other stories, but that stands out. I worked for a county cemetery department years ago. We would go to all the cemeteries in the county and mow or just do basic upkeep. Occasionally people, mainly farmers, would stumble upon some headstones in a field or a stand of trees and we would come out and prod the ground with dowel rods to find more headstones and re-establish the cemetery. Soon after I started working there we got a tip about some headstones a farmer found while clearing out a path through some trees for easier access to his field. It turned out to be the oldest cemetery in the county dating back to the 1700s. After investigating some of the names on the headstones it got really creepy. The story is that before the cemetery was there a schoolhouse stood there. The teachers were a husband and wife. It's not clear on what exactly happened but the students and the husband and wife all died in the schoolhouse. The information we found kind of made it sound like an illness of some kind and they were all quarantined in the school until they all died. After that the school was demolished and the students and husband and wife were all buried right where the school stood. So yeah, I'm sure it's haunted. When I was in college I worked part-time at a Jewish cemetery in reception/office management. The cemetery was closed from Friday afternoon through Saturday evening for Sabbath. We sometimes stayed a bit later in the office on Friday afternoons to get bills out or checks processed. We heard a loud commotion by the cemetery entrance which was locked and only staff could get in and out. The office manager went to see what was going on and made me come with her. We went down to the gate to find an older woman, probably around 70, dressed to the nines begging us to let her in. She kept saying she needed to get back. This was in the suburbs of NJ so you needed a car to get around but we didn't see a car or anything, she was just there in this beautiful dress. We couldn't open the gate without the cemetery manager, so we went to go get him. We brought him back to the gate and no one was there. We looked at video footage of the entrance and you could see us, the office manager and me, talking but there was no one on the other side of the gate. The cemetery manager thought we were trying to trick him. I swear to this day we saw a woman in a fancy dress outside that gate. There were multiple cameras and not a single one picked up anyone on the other side of the gate and you could see the whole gate. All you could see was us. I don't know if it was a ghost or what. The office manager and I decided not to tell anyone else, but we would mention it to each other every once in a while. I dug graves for 6 months. One afternoon we had to hand dig a hole in an older cemetery BC. We couldn't run any heavy equipment over any of the older plots. It was super tough and took us a lot longer than usual. When we were finally close to be done, it was dark and hard to see. I remember my shovel hitting a brick of the neighboring plot, before cement casks, and it coming loose. I swear to God I saw something move inside the small hole and practically jumped out of the grave. I got back in to finish the job, but was definitely spooked. Reminds me of a short story I had read. Coffins used to be built with holes in them, attached to 6 feet of copper tubing and a bell. The tubing would allow air for victims buried under the mistaken impression they were dead. Harold, the Oakdale gravedigger, upon hearing a bell, went to go see if it was children pretending to be spirits. Sometimes it was also the wind. This time it wasn't either. A voice from below begged, pleaded to be unburied. You Sarah O'Bannon? Yes. The voice assured. You were born on September 17, 1827? Yes. The gravestone here says you died on February 19th? No, I'm alive, it was a mistake. Dig me up, set me free. Sorry about this, ma'am, Harold said, stepping on the bell to silence it and plugging up the copper tube with dirt. But this is August. Whatever you is down there, you ain't alive no more, and you ain't coming up. I don't work at a cemetery but I do have a story. Just outside my hometown there is a small castle. Brief history, it was a mod in 1100s and slowly progressed to a castle and Georgian residence throughout time. There is a small burial ground outside of it and my friends decided to investigate the local rumors about a shining light that shone in a powerless section of the place. Anyways, we got there, saw the light and roamed the grounds for somewhere near an hour. It was a very uneasy place, so we decided to leave. We got attacked by a flock of birds. When I got back to my car outside the grounds to drive home, I got an unexpected call from my mother asking was I alright and that she had gotten a very bad feeling about me crossing her mind. I let her know I was fine and would be home in the next 15/20ths of a minute, not to be worrying about nothing. Cut to about 5 minutes later, after I had ended the call and was beginning my drive home. I was pulling out onto the main road and a car with no lights on, in the pitch dark, came and smashed into the side of my car. Nobody was seriously hurt. If the car with no lights had been 5 seconds later, she would probably have killed my friend in the following car, as she would have hit his driver's door rather than my rear door. I will always remember that night. It felt as though we shouldn't have ever been there, and an incident was bound to happen with the feeling around that place. Have never been there since. This was about 6 years ago.